We started a study on the life of David, and we're going to pick that back up today. So if you brought a Bible here in the room, or if you're at home and you have a Bible handy, if you could grab it and turn to the book of 1 Samuel chapter 16, that would be fantastic. Now, let me get us caught up as you're turning to 1 Samuel chapter 16. Let me catch us up a little bit, just as I did last week with some Bible history. Remember, God established for himself a people through Abraham. Remember, he called Abraham all the way back in Genesis. He was Abram then, and he called to him, renamed him Abraham, and he called him to follow him to a land that God would lead him to, and Abraham did by faith. And from Abraham came the patriarchs, and from the patriarchs came the nation of Israel, came God's people. And remember, the patriarchs end, if you will, the book of Genesis in Egypt. And as you turn the page and pick up the book of Exodus, you find God's people down in Egypt, suffering from slavery, and God, after 400 years, raises up a deliverer. He raises up Moses, who comes on the scene, and he delivers the people miraculously out of bondage in Egypt. Again, don't forget that the Exodus story is an Old Testament picture of New Testament salvation, that God raises up or gives his Son as a rescuer to those of us who have been enslaved in bondage to sin, and he delivers us out of that place and into abundant living. And for them back then, it would have been into the promised land. Remember, the people of God, as they came out and were following Moses, were somewhat, for lack of a better term, persnickety, and they were they didn't do a good job of being grateful for the things that God was doing, and so they end up wandering in the wilderness for some 40 years. And that first generation dies off, and they're replaced by their kids. Moses passes away, is replaced by his right-hand man, Joshua, who actually leads the children into the promised land. And then when Joshua passes away from the scene, Israel has a void in leadership, and you enter into a 200-year period of history in Israel's history, where judges, localized judges, would come on the scene in different parts of the promised land, and, if you will, rule God's people. But don't forget that that season was marked by this cycle that was vicious, frustrating to read through, and brutal at times. You see, God's people would sin, and then they would suffer the consequences of their sin, and realize that that was brutal, and they wouldn't like it, and they wanted rescue, so they would pray to God, and they would ask God for salvation, and God would send a deliverer or a judge who would bring them out of that suffering that was the consequence for their sin. And then shortly thereafter, they would start sinning again, and the cycle would repeat itself over and over and over. Now, out of that period, out of the judges' period, you start running into this period that begins, and we start picking up in Israel's history in 1 Samuel, where the people of God are now being led by the prophet of God. And at some point, the people of God decide that they wanted a king just like all the other nations around them. And God makes it very clear to Samuel. Samuel, the prophet, believes this is not a good thing. Samuel rightly discerns that what God's people are doing is not just asking to be like other nations, but they are in the process of asking for a king like all the other nations. They're rejecting the rule of God over them and with them. He had always been their king, and he was meant to be their king. The difference would be he ruled supernaturally in their presence, and so they were to be a peculiar people, but they don't want to be like that. And so they get a king. We know that king's name was Saul. And Saul was a stand-out guy, but he wasn't a stand-up guy, if you will. He stood head and shoulders above everyone else, which is why the people wanted him to represent them. But as you find out in 1 Samuel, in the first 15 chapters or so, Saul had some issues. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, In verse 13, we read this, that Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly, and you have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not continue." Remember Saul, in 1 Samuel 13, he was on the battle scene, and he was waiting for Samuel to show up and sacrifice, make a sacrifice in the name of the Lord in the sense that showing that God's presence was with them. But Saul grew impatient, and he didn't necessarily wait on the Lord or trust in the Lord, so he took matters into his own hands. And again, there's so much there that could be preached, but for the sake of time and where we're going in the life of David, just remember that when we read in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1, that the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul?" Eventually it gets to a point where God rejects Saul as the king of Israel. And he does so after a brutal meeting. I was reading today in 1 Samuel chapter 15, the Israelites were battling the Amalekites. And God had told Saul, he had told the Israelites that were led by Saul, that they were to completely destroy the Amalekites. Everything was to be put to the sword. And Saul goes in, has a victory, but instead of doing as God said, Saul thinks for himself and keeps the good sheep and keeps the good stuff for himself. And Samuel shows up on the scene and says, "What have you done?" That entire group of people, for God's reasons, was to be judged by God, and Saul and the Israelites were the instrument of God's judgment. It's a very hard concept for us to understand today, but this is, again, remember, a perfect judgment coming from a perfect God. But Saul didn't carry it out. He didn't necessarily obey word for word the instructions of the Lord. And so Samuel shows up in chapter 15, says, "What's going on?" He can hear the sheep who were supposed to be destroyed. And the scene ends by Samuel saying, "Get the king of the Amalekites and bring him out." Saul was supposed to end his life, and he didn't. And so the king is brought out, and it's a brutal scene. Samuel, the prophet, grabs a sword, and according to the scriptures, hacked Agag, the king of the Amalekites, into pieces before Saul, the Lord, and the people. Okay, guys, God bless you. Amen. Have a wonderful evening. Enjoy that wonderfully inspiring Bible study. But I bring that up only to make this point that for Saul, what he did or didn't do, he didn't think had far-reaching ramifications. And he didn't take the presence of the Lord very seriously. And because he didn't take the presence of the Lord seriously, he didn't trust in the Lord, and he didn't obey the Lord. Now, again, that ends in this brutal scene. And at the end of the scene, Samuel the prophet goes one way and Saul goes the other. And they won't meet again. And in the meantime, Saul is mourning. He's saddened by the state of Israel and its leadership. And in chapter 16, verse 1, again, the Lord comes to him and says, "Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." Now, all the way back in chapter 13, remember, God had told Samuel that he was going to reject Saul, and he had already picked out a king he had already picked out a man who would be king, and this man, God says, is his man because he would be a man after God's own heart, and according to Acts chapter 13, was willing to do all of God's will. And there's a play on words there, because as you contrast the rule of Saul with the reality of David, because that's who God and Samuel are talking about, you see this difference. Saul was a man after his own heart. David was a man after God's heart. That is to say, Saul's most important priority in life was his life and what he wanted. And he didn't realize that that would affect so many different people. And it's important for us to recognize the same thing. David, however, was a man after God's own heart. The most important thing in his life was the Lord. And David, unlike Saul, was willing to do all of the Lord's will. So when Samuel is sent to Jesse's house, we know as we read the story, he's sent to seek out David. He's sent to seek out David. Let me read how that goes. It says, I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons. And Samuel said, how can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me. And the Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. And invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me him whom I declare to you. So Samuel says, okay, God, how can I do this? Because if I do this, obviously Saul's going to get jealous. We can't trust his mental state. He's going to get jealous and upset, and he might kill me, which is ironic because the very last time Samuel was in front of Saul, he was busy, according to the scriptures, hacking Agag into pieces. Samuel himself was a terrifying person for the normal people. Look at what happens. And Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. And the elders of the city came to meet him trembling and said, do you come peaceably? Remember, as far as they knew, they had just heard about this incident with the king of the Amalekites, Agag. And they were terrified that Samuel would show up on the scene. Samuel reassures him and says that he has come peaceably, verse 5. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Now consecrate yourselves, set yourselves apart, and come with me to the sacrifice. And he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. It's a very dramatic thing. And I want to bring this up because as we're reading through this, right, even though it's going to be a few verses before David comes on the scene, but as we've been making note of 1 Samuel chapter 13, where Saul doesn't wait on the Lord, and 1 Samuel chapter 15, where Saul doesn't obey the Lord. In the meantime, out in a field on the outskirts of Bethlehem, which was on the outskirts of Jerusalem, there was a shepherd existing, keeping watch over his father's sheep. It says this in verse 6, when they came, the sons of Jesse come before Samuel. Don't forget, while this is going on, David is out in this field with his father's sheep, doing what shepherds do. We'll get to that in a minute. When the sons of Jesse came, he looked on Eliab. Samuel sees Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord, 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7 says, I do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Now, we've used this verse over and over and over throughout Christian history to remind us that it's what's on the inside that makes a difference and matters to the Lord. And it's true. He looks for a heart that has been open to him, that has received him, that is in the process of being circumcised by him, is the language he used. It's in the process of being molded and shaped by him. And it's right to do that. But at the same time, as we're considering the context of 1 Samuel chapter 16, it's important to remember that not only is he talking to Samuel, but when he says man looks on the outside, but the Lord looks on the heart, he's making a statement about David, whom he's already said that there is a man that I've chosen. He hasn't named him yet. He hasn't identified him yet. In fact, you could make a case that nobody knew who this man was. And that's the point. We're going to get to that in a minute. But he says, there's a man that I have chosen in place of Saul, who has a heart that longs to honor me and glorify me and do everything according to my will. There is a man, and he won't necessarily be recognized by you because he doesn't stand head and shoulders above everybody else at this point. In fact, he's not even on the scene. We'll get to that. Look at what happens. Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. And then Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen these. Then Samuel said to Jesse, are all your sons here? And he said, well, there remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep. So in the meantime, while all of this is going on, David, the one whom God has already identified in the heavenlies, the one whom God is already aware of what's going on inside of this young man, David, a man after God's own heart, at this point was a nobody that nobody noticed. He was a nobody that no one took time to notice. His own family, his own father, in keeping with their culture, didn't bother to bring the youngest who did just a normal average job. He didn't bother to bring him to the sacrifice. He brought the other sons. David was an ordinary person. Remember, as we think about King David, right? We think about things like giant slaying. We think about things like psalm writing. We think about things, maybe if you're, looking at the whole thing, you think about adultery and forgiveness and repentance. And we think about that. We think about David. You maybe think about dancing before the Lord as he brings the ark back to its rightful place. I mean, there are a lot of things. David, if you look at the whole of Scripture now, looking back, David, outside of Jesus, is one of the most famous of all the Bible characters. In fact, if you go back and look, David is mentioned outside of Jesus more than any other character in the Scriptures. David is made mention of Old Testament. David is made mention of New Testament. David made mention all throughout the Scriptures. And sometimes we forget when we come to a study in the life of David, it's easy to forget that in the beginning, before he was King David, he was the youngest son of Jesse, a shepherd that nobody knew about. He was the youngest son of Jesse, a shepherd that nobody knew about. You see, could it be that a person after God's own heart who's willing to do all of God's will, could it be that you don't have to be somebody, quote unquote, before God can use you to do something? See, David, just so you know, he was ordinary, just a shepherd. Now, we know that according to 1 Samuel chapter 16, that he was also handsome. He was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. Biblical language, not mine. I have no idea what David looked like. Apparently, there are sculptures done where you can check it out, but I don't know what he looked like. All I know is in the culture of in the context of their culture, he was handsome and he was ruddy, which may mean like reddened skin that could have been from all the time he spent outside tending his father's sheep. But he was an ordinary shepherd. He wasn't somebody that you would have looked at when he was young and said, oh, this one's going somewhere. In fact, in the way that their culture was, he was just the youngest son. Not that important. Send him out to the field to protect the flock. He was overlooked because he was the youngest. He was ordinary and overlooked. Ordinary and overlooked. How's that for a description for David? I got to be honest with you, both in the room and out there online. I got to be honest. When I say that David, whom we know was a man after God's own heart, that was willing to do all of God's will, and we made mention last week, he didn't do that perfectly. But as we think about David, it brings me great hope to hear that his origin story was one of ordinary and overlooked. And I think that's important. So I don't know about you guys, but have you ever felt that way? Have you ever felt like, hey, I know that I go to church every Sunday, and we have a pastor named Darren who tends to get a little passionate about what we're supposed to be doing with our lives, and he's always making motions like, go out there and do something. I don't know about you, but have you ever thought to yourself, yeah, but who am I? I'm just I haven't, I'm not, right? I don't know about you, but my life has been filled with those same kind of thoughts. Like, who am I? Like, nobody really knows who I am, right? I don't really have any special skills. I don't have nunchuck skills, bow staff skills. Some of you get that, most of you don't. Sorry, it's a movie reference. I'll fill you in later. I don't have any of those skills. I'm just an ordinary, often overlooked person, right? And what's amazing about this story, what's amazing about this study in the life of David, is our ordinariness, our overlookedness. It doesn't disqualify us from being somebody that God can use to do something. One of the other things, though, that I find amazing is David, not only was he ordinary and overlooked, but if you do a little bit of listening as the story of David unfolds, you also find out David was a little outrageous. He was crazy. He was nuts in one sense. If you guys have your Bibles, turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17 and find verse 31. Just a fast forward, we're in 1 Samuel chapter 17. It's that famous account of when David takes on Goliath. I want to encourage you, tune in and come out next week. Josh will be taking you through the study of David and Goliath, and there's some pretty amazing lessons for anybody who desires to be a person after God's own heart. But remember, Goliath comes on the scene, and he's challenging the people of God, and David says that he wants to do something about it. David says things like, who is this uncircumcised Philistine who thinks he can come out and diss, if you will, our God like that? And look at verse 31. When the words David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go to fight this Philistine. Now remember, I can't talk about too many details because Josh is going to take care of that next Wednesday. However, if you just understand it, David still wasn't all that well known. In fact, he wasn't even at the battle in the first place. I'm saying too much. Remember, he was just an errand boy. His father sent him with the cheese and the bread to go check on his other older battle-tested sons. But when David shows up there, nobody else wants to fight the Philistine. Nobody else wants to have anything to do with Goliath, a trained professional killer since he was a young boy. Everybody's terrified. And David, the shepherd boy, shows up and he says to King Saul, hey, don't worry about it. I got this. Don't worry about it. I'll take care of this. Because you know what? Nobody should talk about our God like that. Again, next week, Josh will do a wonderful job of teaching it, and I can't take all of his thunder. But look at what happens. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. And Saul said to David a reasonable statement. He said this, you're not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth. You're just a young man, and he has been a man of war since he was a youth. So Saul says, look, what are you talking about? You have no business fighting him. He's been a trained killer since he was a boy, and you're just barely more than a boy. You can't do this. Saul thinks it's ridiculous. But look at what David says. David said to Saul, verse 34, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. Okay. Okay. I mean, you don't have to be very tough to tangle with sheep. Does that make sense? However, look at what David says. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. See, here's the interesting thing. David, obscure, unknown, overlooked, ordinary guy, right? He had an ordinary job and an overlooked place in life. But even that was proper training ground for the people after God's own heart. Because even there was responsibility. Even there was opportunity. David said, I used to keep sheep for my father. And if a lion or a bear came and took one of the sheep, not just threatened the sheep, but if he came and took one of the sheep, I chased it down. And when I caught it, I clubbed it upside the head. And I delivered the sheep out of his mouth. And if he turned on me, I grabbed him by the beard and beat him to death. If your blood is not racing at this point. See, I don't know if you guys have ever seen a lion and a bear. I've seen both inside cages. But I have recently seen a bear out in the wild. It was a baby bear, and it was its backside. But nonetheless, I was terrified, and the last thing on my mind was chase the bear down. The first thing on my mind was turn around and go the other way, which is what I did. But David, see, a man after God's own heart, not only was he ordinary and overlooked, but even in those places, he had the opportunity to grow and to be brought up and to exercise an outrageous courage. An outrageous courage. You see, sometimes it's easy to fall into this thinking that I'm not a big deal. I don't have a big deal job. I don't have a big deal position. So I'll never be able to do something that's a big deal. But let us never forget that every single place and every single position we ever find ourselves in is training ground for extraordinary opportunity. It's training ground. You never know when an opportunity is going to come up. You never know what God is going to have come your way that will challenge us and literally fill us with courage for his name's sake. It doesn't matter. You see, the reason I think this study is so important is because in our culture today, you got to kind of be somebody if you want to do something. And in reality, according to the biblical narrative and according to what we see in David's life, nothing could be further from the truth. Don't forget, David wasn't anybody that anyone would notice or take note of. And yet, he was known by the one who mattered most. Because God called him, before anybody else knew him, a man after his own heart, who was willing to do all that God wanted him to do. And David, seen from a distance, was exactly this person. A person after God's own heart doesn't have to be somebody in order to do something, because we, just like he, we are known by the one who matters most. We are known by the one who matters most. We may be unknown among our culture. We may be unknown in our neighborhood. We may be relatively unknown in our job. None of that matters, because a person who is known by the one who matters most is the perfect person to be one who can step up and be a person after God's own heart. Turn to Psalm 139. Psalm 139 is another one of these poetic songs that David himself wrote. It's my opinion that David probably wrote Psalm 139 during that 10-year time period, a decade where he was on the run for his life from Saul. Shortly after what we have just read in 1 Samuel chapter 16, Saul will turn on David and seek to destroy David. And during that 10 years where he was on the run and hiding out, just trying to stay alive, it's my opinion that David himself wrote Psalm 139. Don't forget, during that 10 years, it would have been easy for David to feel like nobody knows what I'm going through. Nobody cares. Nobody's aware. And yet, he wrote some of the most comforting words we'll ever come across. Words that remind us That it doesn't matter if we're somebody or a nobody. It doesn't matter if we're known or unknown in the world around us. What matters is that in Jesus, we're known by the one who matters most. Look at what David says in Psalm 139. In verses 1 through 12, he communicates that God is completely aware of us. David says, "O Lord," Psalm 139, verse 1, "you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in behind and before and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you." See, David, in his ordinary, overlooked, and even outrageous existence, in all of that time he spent out tending his father's flock in those Bethlehem fields, David carved out this relationship with God. And in his relationship with God, he began to pour parts of that out on paper, if you will, parchment, most likely animal skins. And we get Psalm 139. And in verses 1 through 12, we're reminded that no matter what's going on all around us, even when it feels like nobody's aware of what's happening with us, David gives us this amazing reminder that we're known by the one who matters most, and we are known completely. There's nothing that God doesn't know or is not aware of as it relates to you and I. That he's using it all according to his ability to work it out for our good, that we might grow in our love for the Lord, in our discipleship, in our relationship with him. Verses 13 through 18, God is not just completely aware of us, but he's also intimately aware of us. In my head, just so you guys know, verses 1 through 12 is God's awareness like this, if that makes sense. Verses 13 through 18 is God's awareness like this, like God's awareness from this perspective. It says in verse 13 of Psalm 139, "For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sand. I awake and I am still with you." David reminds us, David, unknown by most at the beginning of his story, but known by the one who matters most, reminds us that God is not only completely aware of us, but he is intimately aware of us. He's the one who formed us and made us and molded us and shaped us. He's the one who brought us into existence. David gives us, through these words, the ability to have a great confidence in any and every circumstance, because we know though everything else may fail, God never will. God never will. He's there, and he's there intimately. Well, verses 19 through 24, the rest of Psalm 139, is a reminder that God is not just completely aware of us and intimately aware of us, but he is also graciously aware of us. Look what David says. David says some things that are very honest. He starts by saying this in verse 19. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. O men of blood, depart from me. They speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them as my enemies. This is why I believe that this was during this time where David was on the run and there were enemies all around. But then, look at what David says in verse 23. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. See, David reveals that God is aware of him even graciously. And because God is graciously aware of David, David feels this ability to be honest with God about his feelings, but then to be humble before God, even as it relates to those feelings, by saying, okay, God, here's how I feel, but search my heart. And if there's anything wrong with it, then change it and correct it and lead me in your way, not my own. Do you see that? You see, it's so amazing to me to consider David, who was anointed by Jesse, because that's the rest of that story, right? Then Samuel said to Jesse, are all your sons here? And he said, no, there remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and get him, for we will not sit down until he comes here. And he sent and he brought him. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. Arise, anoint him, for this is he. You see, I got to believe, as we consider this part of David's story, I got to believe that if David, a man after God's own heart, at the very beginning wasn't known by most, but was known by the one who matters most, even to the point to where he is brought to a place of prominence, and the prophet is told, anoint him, for this is he. I got to believe for each and every single one of us, there is multiple points throughout our life where God is identifying to the heavenly realms and that heavenly audience, this is he. This is she. These are them. You see, it's important for us to recognize that it doesn't matter if we have been living a life of obscurity, of ordinary living. It doesn't matter if the world overlooks us. God is still willing to use us, and all he desires is that we have a heart that responds to his knowledge of us in a way that honors him above all things. You see, if we are known by the one who matters most, then we have a responsibility then to allow God's complete, intimate, and gracious knowledge of us. It requires that we also then allow God to use us however he wants. And I suggest there's no small jobs as it relates to the kingdom of heaven and to what God is doing. That God can use us wherever we're at and whatever we're doing, that we are they. We are the ones that God has said, them, there, now. And he, if you will, brings upon us through his Holy Spirit an ability to do whatever job it is that he's calling us to do. Don't forget in 1 Peter that we are called a chosen people. 1 Peter chapter 5, a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a people for God's own possession, that we might proclaim the excellencies of him who has called us out of darkness and into his marvelous light. See, this is the great and awesome calling that all of us have. And it doesn't matter where we've come from or where we haven't come from, how we're known or how we're not known. We all in Jesus have this privilege. And all we have to do is trust that God's complete, intimate, and gracious knowledge of us and his ability then to use us will add to our lives anything for that is required that we might actually not only be a prominent people that are meant to proclaim his excellencies, but he'll equip us to do just that. And wherever we're at and with whatever we're doing is that place where we can make that proclamation. David, a man after God's own heart, may not have been known by many, but he was absolutely known by the one who matters most. And the same is true for you and I. And all we have to ask ourselves is, are we willing to do all of God's will? Amen?